This is the US-made Abrams, one of the 3 types of Western-style tanks that Ukraine is expecting from its allies. And this is the T-72, the Soviet-era tank that's been used most frequently in the war so far. As the Wall Street Journal first reported, the US and its allies have agreed to send tanks to Ukraine, ahead of more intense fighting in the spring. Abrams and German-made Leopards are being sent to Kyiv, in addition to UK-made Challenger 2s. So as Ukraine says getting a significant number of those weapons would be a game-changer, here's how heavy vehicles from the West match up to Russia's older, but much larger, tank fleet. First, let's look at why Ukraine argues that tanks are so important.
So the front lines of this war have been pretty static in the last few months. A lot of the fighting has been taking place along these vast plains and on small hills. And that's the kind of terrain and landscape that allows the big military vehicles to operate pretty efficiently.
The 2 main types of armoured vehicles being used in Ukraine right now are main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, also known as IFVs. Tanks have heavy armour, big guns, and caterpillar treads. When tanks face each other on the battlefield, military experts say they typically look for a weak point along the front line to try and break through and destroy other heavy vehicles. IFVs, on the other hand, are smaller and lighter. They have some of the characteristics of tanks, but their main purpose is transporting infantry safely around the battlefield, while also providing fire support with their smaller weapons. Prior to the invasion, Ukraine had significantly fewer armoured fighting vehicles than Russia.
But now, Kyiv's NATO allies are sending more modern military vehicles to Ukraine.
Today, I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion.
So how will Western tanks help Ukrainian forces?
Well, for tanks, the most important factor is survivability.
Weapons experts measure this by estimating how resistant the vehicles are to anti-tank weapons, like the US-made Javelin or the Russian Kornet, as well as armor-piercing rounds fired by other tanks. Analysts say the Challenger 2 and Abrams tanks, which were both used in the Iraq War, are some of the most protected tanks in the world. That's because they both have a composite armor called Chobham. It uses a combination of steel, ceramics, and other materials to create particularly resistant plates. Military analysts say this protection gives them a major advantage over the T-72, over 500 of which have been destroyed so far in the Ukraine war. German-made Leopard tanks don't use that same armor technology, but have other similar characteristics to the Abrams and Challenger 2. All 3 types have advanced computer systems and modern 120mm guns. Military analysts say they're less vulnerable than the gun on the T-72, which holds its ammunition at the bottom of the turret. On the ground, the tanks, which are expensive and few in number, will also get some extra support.
Other armored vehicles are just as important, and the US has also promised to deliver 50 M2 Bradley fighting vehicles to Ukraine.
The Bradley has a number of modern advantages, including thermal imaging, quicker reload times, and an armor that's believed to be more resistant than their Russian equivalents. That includes the Soviet-era Bump 2, which have been commonly used in the war so far. Hundreds of these vehicles have been destroyed in Ukraine, according to the military tracking site Oryx, while the US says only 3 Bradleys were lost in the Iraq War. But once Ukraine's forces get new tanks, using them effectively won't be easy. Many of these systems use different ammunition and require their own maintenance schedules.
It's still going to take a few months to set up the supply chains, the fuel lines, and the trained crews needed for the Ukraine to take advantage of these weapons. And the few amounts that have been promised so far make it unlikely that it's going to impact the war anytime soon.
Battlefield conditions could also reduce their effectiveness. The Western systems are heavier, meaning that they can be more limited when in boggy areas and crossing bridges. Although its fleet is aging and diminished, Moscow has hundreds more tanks in storage centers. Ukraine, on the other hand, says it needs 300 tanks to push back Russian forces, many more than the initial shipments expected from the West.